welcome to the latest edition of the podcast, Leadership Actually. It's not love, this is all about leadership. And I can't say how excited I am for today. We have got a brilliant guest, but before that, welcome to Lisa Powney.
Thank you, thanks Lee. And welcome to Lee Rogers, your full title again. Lovely to be with you again.
Yeah.
Doing this mad stuff.
I know, thank you.
And an amazing guest. I'm so excited to meet you.
Oh, thanks for having me.
Oh, thanks. So we've got Stacey Copeland, who's got like the biggest list of things that she's done, but more than that, she's so inspiring. And you know, I've been on the radio, on BBC Radio Manchester, I spoke about that, and Stacey's one of the presenters on there, but she does a phenomenal amount of work actually around empowerment of leadership, of female leaders, and about paving the way. We're going to get into that, and today we're going to actually focus on, you know, less, I guess, about, for me and you, Lisa, about what we've got wrong, but the really exciting world and the stuff that we should be doing to really empower female leaders, not just for now, but also in the future. Because when I've listened to Stacey, when I've heard her story, that's the thing that really resonated in the most profound way of anybody I've heard talking about this stuff, and it's so important. So thank you so much for joining us.
No, it's a pleasure.
Lovely. I can't wait to hear your story. You know, really important. I think we'll hear about how you've been like smashing those ceilings, which are really hard to get through, you know, and challenging some of the norms. And I know from myself being a female leader, you know, I have been subject to some of that, the good and the bad, weirdly. You know, I've been in a place where I know that my male counterparts are earning 30 to 40% more than me, and you know, and different things that were impacted. But also I now champion female leadership, you know, often with some of the challenges they're still facing in very male orientated industries, you know, I'm kind of going, not on my watch. So I'm really blessed to kind of hear what you've got to say in that space today. So thank you ever so much for being able to do that. So I think that's where we should start, Lee. Tell us a bit about your story, Stacey, and how you've come to do what you're doing today.
Everything that I do now really has come through sport, I believe. That's been my background. That was my first love. There were all my dreams really were wrapped up in sport, and my purpose and all of my goals since I was like a little kid. And so they came through football and boxing, which were the two sports that I loved and competed in. Yeah. So that's what I would say has led me to everything that I'm doing now has been through the perspective of sport, through the experiences of sport, and through the opportunities it's given me.
When you were little, what was that moment? When did you know, yeah, I really love sport, I want to be in it, I want to do something more with it rather than just play it and enjoy it?
I'm not sure there was a moment as such. I just loved it, and it just took up pretty much all of my time. It's all I wanted to do. So at school, all I wanted to do was play football, at playtime, lunchtime. It's all I wanted to do. And then at the night, I'd be in the boxing gym. And it was just my life, really. I just absolutely loved it, everything about it, both sports. I guess if there was a moment when I thought maybe this is something a bit more serious than just enjoyment, was probably when I was 14 and I was playing for Stockport County, and I was getting in loads of trouble at school. Yeah. And my coach at the time wrote a letter to the school because I got Player of the Year. Yeah. And he did it just to try and I guess help them see there was a different side to me than just getting in trouble all the time. And he wrote this letter about, you know, how I'd played, what sort of team player I'd been throughout the season, but then he put a line in of it's now not a matter of if Stacey will represent England, it's a matter of when. And I'd never sort of necessarily thought of that. I dreamt of it, but not thought of it in realistic terms, and certainly not heard that said by somebody who was, you know, part of my career and obviously a mentor and a coach. And that's when I started to think, if that's even a possibility, then I need to do everything I can to make it so.
Wow, what a defining moment. And you know, I guess how it felt to have somebody really believe in you and back you up and, you know, push you forward.
Yeah, they read it out in assembly, which was a bit weird because obviously I had a certain reputation at school, but I didn't mind because it was about football. If it had been about anything else, I wouldn't have wanted it. But yeah, no, of course, it's and that's why it's really important to sort of express that belief and that encouragement, particularly in youngsters, just because I think we put a lot of emphasis on doing that for young people because they've less life experience, haven't they?
Yeah.
And the earlier that we can help them see things a certain way, see themselves a certain way, and break down the barriers in front of them, the earlier the better, because hopefully they won't have to go through what we've had. They'll have their own battles to fight, but you know, we just hope that we can encourage them as early as possible, and then they can reach their full potential.
Wow. And I think we'll probably get onto that when we look at some of your foundation stuff. And being a female in those sports, I guess it wasn't always easy. What were some of the challenges and the opportunities you got by, you know, really focusing in on those sports?
When it comes to opportunities, I don't think there's been any that have been afforded to me thanks to my gender. I think there's been just barriers in that sense. I think opportunities come for you as an athlete, male or female, if you're obviously persistent and keep working hard, and if you've got the talent and everything else that is required, then the opportunities will come. But I don't think there was anything that was a particular advantage or opportunity for being female. I think it was the opposite. I was aware of that really early when I played in my first primary school game. As I say, it was the only reason I really went to primary school was to play football at playtime and lunchtime. The rest of it I wasn't interested in at all. And then when I got picked for the school team in my first game, the ban by then had been lifted on women's football that was in for 50 years. But the FA didn't yet officially recognise girls in women's football. So there weren't any girls' teams or leagues or structures in place. And you also weren't allowed to play with the boys, which is a silly rule, certainly pre-puberty, because there's no difference between kids at that age. But I got picked for the team, and it was just a great feeling playing in my first proper football game with, you know, not in the playground, but on a proper football pitch with real goals, a real referee, etc. And then partway through the game, a parent and a coach on the other team recognised there was a girl and shouted across the pitch that I'd have to leave, which at the time I didn't have the words to articulate how that felt as a kid, but I felt humiliated, definitely. And I felt like confused, and also felt like a weirdo for doing something that I loved. And for lots of, again, particularly kids who've less life experience, but it can happen to anyone at any age, because it's a strong reaction in human beings to be rejected in that way, because we want to fit in. It's part of our survival instinct, certainly socially anyway. And for lots of people, it just makes them stop pursuing that thing that they enjoy or that they love, or those dreams, or whatever they may be, which is really sad. Because if I imagine that at that point I wouldn't have pursued my love of sport, it's a dreadful thought, because, you know, look what it's given me in my life. It's a terrible thought to think that wouldn't have been there. But for whatever reason, I wasn't wired that way. And I went home and I said to my mum, "You're going to have to cut my hair short," and she did. And I was given a boy's name, and that's how I was able to continue playing football. But I think it does. I've heard some footballers talk about that same thing and say it helped them a bit because they just wanted to fit in and whatever. But I think for me, you can't be a full self. And so there's always going to be, you know, so it made me question myself a bit of what's wrong with me. Yeah. And it took me a very long time to realise there wasn't anything wrong with me, not for that anyway. Yeah. You know, I was just doing something different that wasn't accepted yet. And I know there's still a real difficulty for a lot of girls now. It is much, much better though, which I'm delighted about, but I know a lot of girls still face a similar stigma, as do boys if they're doing things that are considered traditionally feminine, like dance or whatever. And really, that ought not to be happening. We should just be, you know, if people love something, if they enjoy it, there shouldn't be stuff for boys and stuff for girls. You should be able to pursue it with your entire being and reach your full potential, whether that's just loving something your whole life or being elite and reaching the top level, and it doesn't matter because it's going to enrich your life. So, you know, I hope that can be the change eventually for everybody.
Yeah.
But it's the way we speak about things is really interesting as well, because, like, for example, we've got the Euros, women's Euros going on at the moment, and there was a certain penalty shootout that took place last week, and the penalties were poor. Of course they were. They were terrible. You know, you can't say they weren't. There were a couple that were incredible, but there were a few that were rubbish, for want of a better word. But the interesting thing was the reaction then on social media was suggesting that says something about women's football in its entirety. and the gender of those players came into question. That doesn't happen in men's football when there's one individual makes a massive mistake, or there are a number of poor penalties in a row. We don't say, well, that's men's football for you. We just say those individuals have made a mistake, and that's the difference. That and somebody had said something, it was an old coach of mine who'd said, I always defend the women's game, but you can't defend that. We're not defending the entire women's game over a few poor penalties where, some of them in those cases were teenagers who were stepping up in front of, tens of thousands of fans, millions of people watching. They haven't dealt with that kind of pressure before. Of course, they're able to strike the foot competently through a ball from 12 yards away, but the pressure does something to your entire, adrenaline, your nervous system, everything else. And then you don't perform as well. That's what can happen. But we ought not to have to defend women's football and our right to exist unless we're perfect every single time, because we're not going to be. We're human beings. And that's the difference. And sometimes you shouldn't respond to everything everybody says. But I think sometimes it's important to make people aware. Can you see what you're doing there that's different to how you would respond to the same scenario in the men's game? Because they just might not be aware of it, and then sometimes they might go, oh yeah, and then do it differently next time, which is particularly important if there's youngsters around them that they're saying that in front of. God knows how many homes have had that on the telly, and there's been somebody who's said, see X, Y and Z about women's football, and there's little ears hearing it, and that's a real shame. But what have we done when England men have lost on penalties? We've said we need to go back to the drawing board. We need to see what's going wrong here. Obviously, their process isn't quite right. That process of choosing the five, or the first five anyway. What's going through your mind? How do you mentally prepare in that, what feels like a very, very long walk to that penalty spot? And in those few crucial seconds before you strike that ball, what do we need to work on? Maybe it's, because they're worried about what will be in the papers the next day. Maybe it's the pressure. Maybe it's that legacy of missed penalties before. We talk about all that. Never ever once have we said, because they're men. That's obviously what it is. But we do with women, and that's where I'd like to move us on from, really.
Yeah, and I think you talked about, I guess in there is like that creating awareness. There's so much alignment between that scenario of sport and the world of work and the world of life, really, girls experiencing life, and leaders, and they experience and they shut down. I've seen the most strongest women I can ever report, like voices closed down because that's happened, because they're a female, that's why that's happened, or they've tried to have to be something they're not, cut their hair short in an analogy, become more masculine, or, in a way that doesn't really align with them. It's a really big area to tackle, and you said about, I guess, the first is creating awareness. What have you been doing, or how have you been helping in that stuff? Because I can tell that that's something you're really passionate about.
It depends on the scenario. I couldn't say something very generic, because it completely depends. Like the way you might approach something in sport might be different to how you do it in sports broadcasting. It'd be different to how you do it in a school environment. So it depends what it is, really. It'd have to be a specific example, but I think sometimes it's about just putting subtle suggestions in there, and as you say, just trying to help, because once you've seen something, it's difficult to unsee it. So use of language, for example, the fact that we still use girl as an insult, just the word girl, like you can call a boy girl and they know it's an insult, which is ridiculous that we're still doing that. Then obviously you can go a bit further and say they're throwing like a girl, kicking like a girl, and that's to mean you're doing it not very well. Now there's reasons to that, because often girls are not encouraged to throw over and over again or kick over and over again. So just like if a boy's right-footed and has practiced that skill on their right foot millions of times, they can't transfer it to the left foot. It won't be as skilled. It's the same thing. If girls are given the chance to practice a certain skill, punching, kicking, throwing, whatever it might be, again and again and again, they can be just as good technically as any male. Better if the male hasn't practiced as much. So these are things that need breaking down. But if you make people aware of that language, for example, and so when I go and do talks, there's been a number of times when women have approached me after a talk and said, I was just like you when I was younger. I was a tomboy as well. And I've never been massively offended by it, of course not, but now I will challenge that and I'll say, I actually don't consider myself a tomboy. And the reason for that is because it's just a label. It doesn't explain what I've achieved, what I've overcome, what I stand for. It's just a label, and it undermines us. You know, why would an athlete who's represented a country in 2 sports be called a tomboy? Yeah. It doesn't make any sense whatsoever. Do you know, that'd be like saying to a double Olympian, you know, male in whatever, saying, that I was a bit boisterous like you. Yeah. What you know, like they're an elite athlete. So, yeah, little things like that. So there's many examples of the ways that you can challenge things, but you don't have to challenge it every time. No. You know, sometimes there's other factors to consider, and it's not always right to challenge everything, and you can't challenge everything in the same way. But I think when you can, it can either be just that change of language or rhetoric, or it can be something major, like I had to do with the Commonwealth title belt. That was a different type of scenario.
Do you want to tell us a bit more about that?
So after I'd turned professional, the reason for that, I'd won the national title a couple of times. I'd got a European silver medal. I'd been to the World Championships. All that was left for me really in amateurs was to go to the Commonwealth Games and or the Olympics. And when they announced that women's boxing would be coming into the Olympics, all of us that were involved at international level were like just beyond excited, don't even come close, only to find out there'd only be 3 weights. So if you didn't fit into one of those weights, then it was just devastating, because we assumed it would be equal. Why would it not be? So we compete in 13 at the majors, and so to get down to 3, you're talking a very small amount of fighters. So there wasn't anything left for me to do really in the amateurs, so I turned pro. I was only the 6th female in the UK to get a professional licence. Lots of managers and promoters wouldn't even go near women's boxing back then. Obviously it's a lot more popular now, and they've realised there's, you know, a good business side to it, so fine. But it was unproved back then, or unproven. But yeah, we did a few fights in the small hall shows, and then got the chance to fight in Zimbabwe, which was amazing. And you know, I'd never been part of a build-up like that before. Over 1 million people watched it on the free-to-air sports channel over there. I was the first person to box in Zimbabwe for 36 years, so it was a huge, you know, first Brit, sorry. So it was a huge build-up. It was amazing. Went to visit schools, and we did a public workout in the community and all that. It was great. The fight was really tough, because she was an absolute unit, but we came through it and we won. And I became the first British woman to win the Commonwealth title, but I didn't get a belt after the fight, which of course is a point in sport, isn't it, to get that trophy, that medal, that belt. And that was gut-wrenching, to say the least. But I thought that would be the worst bit, but it wasn't. It was coming back to Manchester Airport, where lots of mine and my coaches, friends and family had come to surprise us. And my family told everybody they could in the airport that I was coming back with this belt. And I hadn't had the heart to tell anyone back here that I didn't have a belt, because they were so excited. And I thought, I'll just have to borrow one off somebody before I sort of see everyone. Anyway, when I came back, you know, it was one of the worst moments of my career, really, coming to the airport and not having that belt to share with the people who meant the most to me. Yeah. And it wasn't to do with ability or talent. That's your human dignity, really, and you know, equality, which sport is one of the best things on the planet for bringing out the best of human beings, and it ought to always amplify that. When it does the opposite, it's really disappointing. But I spoke to the head of the Commonwealth Boxing Council when I returned to the UK on the Monday, having boxed on the Friday, and said what a great experience it had been, but not getting the belt wasn't quite the fairy tale I'd had in mind. And he said, well, the manufacturers of the replica belt have ceased production. So I said, well, what's that got to do with me? So he said, well, they do real belts for men and replica belts for women. Wow. So I said, my God, that's really weird. And I said, well, how quickly can I have a real belt? So he said, well, we've got lots here at head office, so you can have one within a couple of weeks. But they are quite expensive, so unless you've got a sugar daddy, you won't be able to have one. Wow. Which is really difficult to put into words, that sense of injustice that burns within you. And you know, I've been dealing with this since I was 6-7 years old, and I was 36 now, and I thought, my God, I can't believe, you know, I've made history, I've proved myself, I've been part of this massive fight, and won this title, and this is still getting spoken to in this derogatory manner. And I said to him, you shouldn't have said that. And he said, I didn't mean it in that way. And what other way can you mean it? But it had been said. And we do have to be mindful about how we fight these battles, because, you can get accused of being too hysterical, too emotional, too aggressive, whatever. But I said, look, this just can't happen to a future female champion. So they agreed to make a women's Commonwealth title belt, which we got. That was in the July when I boxed, and we got it in the December. And a couple of years ago when I was commentating, I got to see that belt handed. I was commentating that belt handed to a young fighter called Emma Dolan, and you don't always get to see the change that you've been part of. And so to be there ringside and see someone else have their moment was really quite special. So it could be something like that, or it could just be, saying to somebody, I don't think we're tomboys though, like, I've done this in sport, tell me about you, like I said before. And some women who've said, I'm like you because I'm like a tomboy, then tell me all these incredible things you've achieved, and I'll say, just do me a favour, next time you're having a conversation with someone, always tell them that bit. And that happened actually, me and my dad went to see Roberto Duran, and we did a thing it was like an evening with him, and we did a thing at the half time thing or whatever with him. And it was actually a gentleman that approached me after and said, my daughter's a tomboy just like you, And I said, tell me about your daughter. And he told me about this amazing 11-year-old kid who'd done all these things. And I said, right, in the future, never ever refer to her as a tomboy. And he was like, oh, sorry. And I said, no, I'm not saying it for that reason. You obviously beaming, bursting with pride about this amazing, little girl that you're raising. But just tell everybody that. Likewise, don't go home and tell her you've met a tomboy. Tell her you've met someone who's representing the country in two sports and, overcome adversity and kept dedicated and realised the dreams, and, tell everyone that she's doing that as well. So sometimes, and I don't think he will. I think every time he talks about his daughter, he'll tell what an amazing 11-year-old girl, or whatever age she'll be now, rather than saying she was a tomboy. So there's lots of different ways, isn't there, of challenging stuff when the time's right. But I think what's key to it is having that toolkit, if you like, with which to challenge it. And I didn't have that as a youngster. Yeah. When I was 16 and I got my first England call up, and I worked in a factory in Stockport, and I went to my boss and asked for the week off. He said, what for? And I gave him the England letter. I was really excited. I don't think my feet were touching the floor. I think I was floating. And after a while, he didn't say much at all. And then he said, you want me to give you a week off to play for a women's football team? I said, well, it's the England team. And he made all these jokes and innuendos. And I said, look, it means a lot to me. Can I just take it unpaid? Which he agreed to. But I left that interaction feeling silly for thinking it was a big deal, not to play for the England team, but the England women's team. And I almost felt ashamed, really, for, what I was doing. I didn't tell any of my colleagues that I was going, and they were brilliant. When I got back, it was in the paper, and they said, you said you were going to Spain. I said, I did. And they, I thought you were going to Benidorm or something. I was playing in the European Championships for England, and they were magnet. And honestly, they made such a fuss, and it really, changed my perception of myself then, because, you do take cues off other people, especially like when you're 16. And I'd never had any other narrative. I'd always been told, you're no good, nobody's interested, it's weird that you're doing it, we've all heard it, we still hear it now. So I didn't have any other, like I say, narrative with which to challenge that. So that's what's really key, I think, not necessarily how you challenge every situation and how you go about it and when. It's, have you got that toolkit and that understanding? Because we can't change every man like him or woman like him who is sat behind that desk. But what we can do is make sure that everyone who comes out of an interaction like that, particularly young people, is that they don't come out of it feeling ashamed like I did, but they can come out of that feeling proud of who they are and what they've done. And that happened for me for a number of reasons. One, understanding the history of women's sport, all the things we've been banned from, all the myths that had been in place, that, we couldn't run marathons because our uterus would fall out. That's just daft, unless it's true, and then mine fell out ages ago. Don't know what it was for anyway, but c'est la vie. And so then I started to get an understanding, I'm not weird for wanting to do sport. Loads of women have wanted to do sport before me. They just weren't allowed. So that instantly changes your perception of yourself, of the people who came before you, of the greater understanding. And I had loads of role models by the time I had that conversation about the Commonwealth belt, women in politics, in business, way beyond sport as well, to which I knew that was the wrong thing for him to say, and I shouldn't just internalise it and go away feeling bad. that needed to be challenged. But yeah, I think having that narrative and that toolkit, you know, understanding who's come before, what's come before, the history, the context is really, really important.
I genuinely got goosebumps. Now, it is a bit cooler in this, and I did, you know, when I've listened to you before, because I see the parallel in the business world with like the bits, and then in education actually, and around, you know, what really resonated is when you say the more we can do this at an earlier stage to challenge attitudes, behaviours, beliefs, language. That really resonates with me as well. Having been a primary school teacher in the past, I think the more that we can do that around stuff around toxic masculinity, about equality, that's the stuff that really drives me. And I know when we originally spoke, like when I've got an 8-year-old daughter, it's going, well, what's the world that you want to create? And not just for my daughter, but collectively. The fact that you did, like, turn something such with adversity into something about somebody else is just hugely powerful and significant. There's not many people I know that have the ability to do that, and I think you've got, and I see it and I hear it, you've got an ability to reach people at another level. That story honestly compels me every single time, and I'm really excited to see what that does in the future states, because you're right, it's still prevalent today. There's so much work to do in this space. In sport, you know, sports actually in some regards really progressive. Football's the fastest growing sport in the world right now. It's getting lots of focus and attention because there's people at the start of this journey that have helped pave the way. You know, and I know you've explained that so eloquently, but there's so much work to do.
There is, and social change happens generally in 3 stages, where the first stage is ridicule. That's what my generation had almost across the board. You just get ridiculed all the time, really, in one form or another. And then the next phase is discussion. For example, when something like the Euros is on, you'll have people say, I don't like women's football, but she's good, or that team's good. That's the discussion phase, where it's not blanket ridicule, but there's bits of nuance. And then the third stage is acceptance, where you just accept, and that's where we you know, there's a lot of people at the discussion phase. So some people are still at ridicule and may never, you know, those are the people that we almost have to leave them with it, because we may never be able to help them. But the discussion phase is things like that, saying, you know, if there's a poor penalty or a goalkeeper makes a mistake in women's football, they can't do it, that's discussion. We need to move on to acceptance that individual made a mistake. It isn't anything to do with their genitalia, funnily enough. There's absolutely nothing. Like, you and I could go in a boxing gym, I will be a better boxer than you, because I've trained to do that since I was a child. Yeah. Do you know what I mean? So that's how it should be. There's absolutely nothing about your biology, you know, that would make, when you actually think of it like that, it's so silly. It's really silly. Now, there are certain advantages that you will have as a male once you've gone through puberty in certain sports, like you'll have increased power, you'll have an increased cardiac output, VO2 max, etc., because that's what the male biology generally affords you. A trained male, that is.
I was going to say,
not everyone. No, I don't.
It's an image of like you knocking me out with the first.
No, I don't just mean you. I mean, but the reason I'm saying that is because we get a lot of males who, like to say, they'll go, oh, I'd beat Serena Williams. Right, okay. Like, not just an average male won't beat an elite female. But what I'm saying is a trained male will obviously outperform a trained female in most sports where anything to do with power, strength, is a feature, because it's increased in use. It's obviously advantageous. But other than that, in terms of skill, technical ability, anything like that, it's no different. When you actually think, really, it's about whether it fits in with that masculinity and femininity, where masculinity and femininity fits in, and that is where it comes into leadership. Because if we list feminine, what are considered feminine traits and masculine traits, there's all the masculine ones that people traditionally have thought lend themselves to better leadership. Yeah. That's really what the problem is. It's nothing to do with our physical makeup, in my opinion.
Really strong, absolutely. And you talked about social change, those 3 stages. So how do you help girls, could be boys, but girls, be resilient through that? If that's the way it is, how do they hold their ground to you know, help make change and actually not be put off from doing what they love.
I think there's an element of who people are, because I just was like that, you know, from being young, and I don't think we can expect everyone to be like that or mould them into that, or certainly not be on their time. You know, you might not be like that as a 10-year-old, but you could be by 30, for example, and everyone will develop and get there in their own time. So I think if kids are quiet and a bit reserved and whatever at 12, 13 years old, that's all right. I don't think we need to freak out. You know, they'll come to it. They'll come to it in their own time. And likewise, if they're really outspoken, that's who they are. You know, and they'll probably learn just to taper it when they need to. So I think when it comes to development and stuff like that, it'll happen when it does. I don't really believe in building resilience, to be honest, because I just believe we all are resilient anyway. I think we're born resilient. Because if you look at able-bodied babies, none of us would ever walk, talk, feed ourselves if we weren't resilient, because babies will try and sit up and wobble, and then they'll try and sit up and wobble, and then they'll crawl and fall again and again and again, try and stand up and they keep falling, try and walk and they keep, I mean, it happens thousands of times before they go, oh, I think they've got it, yeah, and then they do that funny walk, and then they can walk. You know, whether it's clapping, clicking the fingers, everything takes practice again and again and again. At no point does a baby sit down and say, I'm a right failure. Like, what does this say about me, about who I am, and what's everyone going to think? And, you know, baby Joe over there, he's already walking, you know, and starting that comparison. Those are the things that, as we get older, hinder our resilience. Because we would try things again and again if it wasn't for the fact that we get what people call imposter syndrome, if you want to use that term, comparing ourselves to other people. You know, all of these things that start to come in, the ego can be very unhelpful. It can be helpful as well, but it can be very unhelpful in different scenarios. So I think there's things that that hinder our resilience and dilute our resilience as opposed to needing to build it. So I'd be more interested in people of any age, girls or boys, you know, male or female, trying to look at what those things are that take away our resilience and how we can remove those rather than building it. Because you can build it all you want, and you can build, and then if someone's still going to compare themselves to someone else, it's gone in a heartbeat, isn't it?
I love that, because I think we've been through a trend in the leadership world where we give our leaders more resilience training or more resilient stuff, and then we think we can throw more at them, you know, rather than, well, you've had the training, you've had that, so we'll just throw more of the bad stuff at you and you should be able to handle it.
And I think it's really confusing now, isn't it? Because you get 6 million messages before breakfast if you're on social media, or, you know, you might listen to radio or TV or whatever. There's that much thrown at us. And it's so mixed, like, find the balance, remember what's important, have time for yourself. You know, you're supposed to look after your skin on your face by doing special things for that, and then look after, you know, the rest of your body, look after your organs, I mean, there's that many things, like put shiny things in your hair, you know, there's a million things, you know, aesthetically and cosmetically before they get to, and then do an ice bath, then do some meditation, then eat some kale, then have a smoothie, prepare all your food and chop everything up. Yeah. So you get that, and then you get, but be the best you can be, achieve everything you can, you're going to die soon, we've only got so many days, there's 6 million thousand seconds in a day. And you're like, Jesus, like, it's quite confusing, isn't it, of who you're supposed to be, what you're supposed to be, what you're supposed to be doing. So I think it can be difficult for people to go, oh, what do I actually want to do? What's important to me? But it's difficult to do when you're being bombarded with all this stuff all the time.
I think you talk about systems and environment is so important. That's from a leadership point of view. Like, what's the culture you create? What's the environment you create?
Yeah, exactly.
For people to thrive in whichever facet they're in.
Yeah.
That's the stuff
Thank
that
you.
Actually lots of people are really conscious and focused on these days, and I think it's actually a responsibility of a leader, probably more so now than it's ever been, for all that's come in, and to really strive towards equity in a way that we've probably never had a focus on before. I take your point about going back to the 3 pillars. I still think we're almost beginning the conversation. I don't know what your experience is, Lisa, around the discussion around gender equity in the workplace.
I think when you said I picked up education, and then challenging the languages and having role models. I think we've come a little bit on the journey, but actually we probably haven't done enough of all those three. I think if we just focused on those 3 points, and there's lots of other things I'm sure in your toolkit, then we could move a lot more further forward as a, you know, as a leadership population. But I don't think we're there in any of those points yet. You know,
I think there's a lot about male and female as well that there are, and it was interesting, one of the conversations that I had after a talk last year, and a woman came up to me after and said that she'd set up one of the women's groups at that company, and she said, I've always felt a little bit uncomfortable with it, that should we be doing stuff just for women? And I said, well, yeah, sometimes it is important. When you look at mental health groups where you can come together, predominantly they are all for men. I don't think I've ever heard of a group specifically for women. I'm sure there might be one, but you very rarely hear about it, because that's just what we do anyway. We're socialised to do that, and maybe, maybe that's the factor, I don't know, but we're socialised, and it's socially acceptable, let's say, for us to have those conversations. For men, not so, and they suffer because of it. So we've addressed it, and we've set up groups where men can go to, do an activity together, but then can have those conversations. So it might be a walking group or a football group or whatever. And would we say, I don't think there should be stuff for men, so let's not have it? No, of course not, because it's saving lives at the extreme end, or just making lives a bit better at the other end. Both are, really good things. So I don't think we should also say we shouldn't have stuff for women and stuff for men. I think there's a place for it, definitely. However, I think when we talk about things in the workplace, in education, and whatever, we should allow space to have conversations about how both things affect one or the other. Because if things get better for women, I don't think they automatically get worse for men, and vice versa. So I think that's the conversation, not how to be a man. You know what I mean? Like, you just become one, don't you? Just carry on growing post 18. Being a successful man, though, what does that mean?
And I think,
is it being a good dad if you're a dad? Is it being a good partner? Is it having a value system? Is it being part of your community? Is it being kind? Do you know what actually is it? Or is it having loads of money, having a big car, because when you look on social media, the people with the biggest followings, that's who they are.
Yeah.
And that's what our young men are aspiring to. And like I say, that guides their decisions. And if they don't make it, what then? If they continue trying to make it, they get themselves in all sorts of vulnerable situations. It's a really important discussion.
Yeah, and what I love there about is, like, you start something off like with the most simplest terms, go back to your like baby analogy, resilience, right? And then I think you're right, I think we overcomplicate lots of stuff or make lots of assumptions. And underlying that is what's a belief system? And so we say society, or what's in a family, or what's in education, what are the belief systems that we then need to unpick, or at least explore further down the line to say, is that relevant, does that work, does that serve people well? Because if you're aspiring as a young boy to be a millionaire and you're nowhere near it, well, that's not serving you well, is it? Like you say, what's the fallout of that? So what are the processes, what are the discussions that we need to have, and how do people access them at different levels so that we can go through this work and this piece? Because I think you're right. I think it's really important.
I think it's really difficult because things have got better for women in lots of different ways. Of course they have. We couldn't have loans in our own name. We couldn't have, own property. Lots of things have obviously got a lot better. But when they released a study a few months ago about boys and all these concerns about boys and how they were, failing in schools, constantly. In a lot of these articles, it was then saying things have got a lot better for women, but they haven't got better for women at the expense of boys. Yeah. A breakdown in society, in community, lots of things have caused that. Where we're talking about it's important for men to be more emotional, if that's the right word, to talk about their feelings more. I think we all recognise it is important because of the huge consequences if they don't, which we see with the horrific numbers of suicide and so on, and that's the suicide numbers. That's without factoring in the amount of people who just suffer day in day out for years and just never take that step, but their whole life is suffering. That's not great either. No. Do you know what I mean? It's never over for them, so I don't think that's great either. But we don't tend to talk. We tend to focus on the suicide numbers, which are horrific in themselves. So we know it's really important, but people have got to be honest. Is that for some people, they don't want that. They don't want men expressing that. They don't want women going out, they want the traditional thing of, you know, women being at home with kids. So, and that's all right, but you've got to be honest about those conversations, haven't we? And really say, I think what you said before, who's it serving and why? That's the important conversation, isn't it? Because they're difficult, aren't they? Because people think, actually, you know, I quite like that thing of a knight in shining armour and do you? That's all right. That's okay. But if we only expect that, and then if it stifles everybody else's aspirations, then is it serving the greater good? That's the question, isn't it?
Stacey, you definitely tackle the harder subjects, you know, and they're not easy to say and talk about, you know, and loads of that resonated. I've got a young boy who's 7, and, you know, I constantly think about that, and hearing a lot of the conversations recently, it does feel like it's still them and us.
Yeah.
It's still like an opposing, you know, well, because women have got this, then we're in this position. I think it's a really scary place, and like, how do we have those conversations with?
And it changes, by the way.
Yeah, it changes.
We could have this conversation in maybe not 12 months would be drastically different, but, you know, a couple of years, 3 or 4 or 5 years, and we'd think something completely different. Yeah. And that's all right. That's normal. Do you know, as we sort of recognise things and experience different things, we might go, actually, we were totally wrong about that. This is the way to go. And that's all right. I think the important thing is having those conversations, and for the right reasons.
As a collective, though, I think that's the biggest thing I've taken. It's not a women have this conversation, men have this conversation. And if we come together and do it as a collective and be open to whatever that might come, I think we make progress. I think we move forward, you know, with that education and, you know, that awareness. And we understand what it's like to be in each other's world. Sometimes that's what's missing as well, isn't it? You know, but you can only do that if you talk about it, if you face into that, if you do it. And, you know, you don't talk about women and equity as just women. You know, you really are on that page that we have to do it together.
Yeah. Like, it's great that menopause is being talked about a lot now in the workplace, but we also ought to be talking about what happens to men when they have a drop in testosterone, which for years we've made a joke about midlife crisis. Yeah. Well, they've bought a motorbike, they've done this, they've done that. Of course, there's a jokey side to everything. I think you should always allow humour in the right context, in the right time, and whatever, in the right taste or whatever. But it can't only be that. We also need to have serious conversations about what happens to men when their testosterone drops and they don't know what's happening to them. Just like how the effects of menopause might be far more severe on average for most women. All right, well, let's discuss that then. That's fine. But the fact that that certain stage of life affects men as well, we should discuss that. So I think they should always be discussed, maybe not right at the same time, but they should both have space in the workplace to discuss that, or whatever setting it is. Hence why it's important to, you know, not always isolate things and talk about how it affects men and women together.
Yeah. You know what? A brand new perspective you just opened up for me there. And I've spoken and championed a lot about menopause actually in those conversations. But I think you're right, and I think why that's important is the cultural change piece is there's likely to be more engagement in the conversation, because actually there's almost what's in it for me a little bit.
Of course, and you can relate to it.
Yeah, absolutely.
Exactly. Because I think we've treated this, first menopause was just a joke constantly, like every comedian made a joke about it, everybody made a joke, you know, or then it was just a pure, well, it's nothing to do with me, that's the missus, you know, whatever. Now we're getting to the point where men are a bit like, okay, right, this is what's going on. If we could get to the point where we can both relate to each other, because obviously not everyone's in, you know, heterosexual relationships, but a lot of people are, so that helps, that understanding with your own partner. But whether it's people you work with, family members, friends, if we can understand equally. And the importance of it is that if, let's say, a man or a woman comes to somebody and says, this is going on, that's going on, they can go, do you know what, Lee? Have you had, it could be testosterone, you know, that it's and they can go and seek someone, and then within a couple of weeks, even if it's not, you know, fixed, so to speak, or better, because that can take time, just knowing what's going on makes it completely differently for human beings. Or you could say, they go, you might be menopause, you know, or perimenopause. Oh God, I hadn't thought of that. And then they can start getting the help they need. Even for that, it makes such a big difference, rather than saying, there's something wrong with me, what's going on? Oh my God, you know what I mean? That's not great, is it? It's not a great place to be. Whereas if you can start saying, it could be that, and other people go through it, and it's normal, then you can find what's right for you. It's not going to be right for everyone to go to a group, but or to even to their GP, but there'll be they might be a person who likes to do it quietly and read a book and find out about it. Whatever it is, at least they can access that, can't they, by having these open discussions. But if none of us have got a clue, we're all suffering like we don't need to.
Yeah, so powerful that. Even that alone, right? Those two topics there, despite all the attitudes, beliefs, it's almost like there's a journey all the way through, isn't it? But they're doing it together, they're having the conversations together openly. Sometimes, like you say, it will be more sensitive, it's right to have kind of isolated conversations, but there's so much to go at, and that's why, in my view, in my opinion, I think there's so much work to do in this space.
Yeah, and I think you're right, like I said before, that there are times it needs to be, like there's lots of things going on now for dads, and there's groups that, you know, advocate for the issues that dads are facing, and I think that's really important, because sometimes you need to have, you know, a niche thing to really move the needle on a specific topic. However, that conversation should always go hand in hand with how it affects everything else or everybody else in society. So, for example, with dads, traditionally that's been another joke, hasn't it, like about changing nappies, or, you know, we still get hands-on dad. How do we have hands-on dad as still being a, you know what I mean, he's very involved dad? It should be. You've created the human being and brought them into the world. That surely is a minimal expectation. But if we're going to do that and just be flippant about dads, then the problem is on the other side, which I don't agree with, that now, and we've gone full circle, which we often do, we go ridiculous on the pendulum, that women didn't used to have any rights over their own children. And I mean, the suffragettes, most of them had the children taken from them, and that was perfectly legal, and they didn't have any rights. But now we've gone completely the other way, which is equally ludicrous, where if parents break up in a male and female, then the dads have no rights whatsoever. You know, and often they're kicked out of the house, they're destitute, they're starting all over again, they've got massive bills to pay to support the family, and don't get any access to the kids. That's devastating to the children, to the dad. It's terrible. So if we're going to make fun of dads and say it's not important, then we really ought to think about the serious end of that and what that actually means. If it's not just a joke, but we actually undermine and undervalue dads, there's a really serious consequence. So these dads advocate groups are really important, but it should happen in conversation somewhere of how that's better for the children at large, how that's better for women in the relationships, and so on. And so it should be that if we're talking about maternity leave for mums and the coming back to work thing, how does that affect the other partner, the kids? So yeah, I think, you know, certain groups to look at specific stuff, but always a conversation about how it affects the broader system or society that we're in and other people, because that's ultimately surely what we're doing it for.
Honestly, so two quick things on that. I remember having 2 weeks paternity leave and going, how on earth can I support my wife?
How is it good for anybody? Exactly.
I was like, literally, she can't, like, she's struggling to function. I'm going, 2 weeks I've almost got to supercharge and be on hyper alert to even help. I took 2 other weeks, like, paid holiday or whatever. But even that month was like gone in a heart.
Of course it is.
And it was like, I had zero impact on it. That's how it felt. And then I often think about, like, how can I help her in terms of her career aspirations? What do I do day in, day out that helps support that? Now, I'm not advocating that, like, this is a messy class, right? I don't get it all right, far from it. But I am conscious of there's almost a broader ecosystem on the decisions I make and the decisions she makes. And even last night I said, you know, thanks for all your support, marketing, all that sort of stuff. She's good at that. She's head of marketing, so she should be. Like, and she just said, Lee, we're a team. Like, everything we do, we're a team.
100%.
We talk about it.
But isn't that better for everyone?
Yeah.
Isn't that better than you coming home with a ton of stuff on your shoulders, all bottled up, where you're struggling and you can't talk to your partner about it because that's tradition and you're supposed to be stoic? No, my God, no. Like, and sometimes, like, the so-called hardest men, you know, like boxers are considered. Yeah. The amount of times I've been in changing rooms after the biggest fights in boxers' lives, and who's there? That partner. Yeah. That's the one who's holding the head up, who's got their arm around them, who they can cry to, who they can be devastated with, who's picking that person up. That it helps them. How is that not helpful? Do you know, like, it's a good thing. And like you say, being a team's really important. But whether it's that first part after pregnancy, which, by the way, I think we just expect women to do, and it's like, I've never, you know, I had a child, but I've been a birthing partner, and it's just horrific, the whole thing. It's, oh my God. But I think because so many women do it, and we just kind of go, well, that's it. I don't think we actually appreciate just what an ordeal that is. The 9 months, then the actual labour, and then looking after this small person for forever that relies on you for everything. I don't think we appreciate that, but also, like, that's why the partner is really important, whether male or female. And by the way, you're speaking to a friend of mine who's a firefighter, and she's in a same-sex couple, and they're about to have a baby, and some of the firefighters were saying, well, you know, you'll get more time. She said, no, I get exactly the same as you, because I'm considered like as the paternal parent as such, so I get the same as you. So again, it helps everybody. If it makes it better for males, then same-sex couples will benefit because they get more time too, because it'll just be the other parent, whoever or whatever they may be, will also help whoever it is that's actually given birth to that life. Do you know, male or female, they can help them. Let's get rid of that bit. You know, it shouldn't. And also, you will get women who have a lot of so-called masculine traits, and a lot of men who'll have more feminine traits. That's all right. I think we should just call them traits, human traits, and just get rid of masculine and feminine, and whether, because that's what we associate feminine, or that means women, and that's, you should be all those things, and men, you should be all those. And actually we should be a mix of all of them, because like when I was boxing, I don't want to be nurturing and kind when I'm on my ring walk, and compassionate and altruistic. I need to be focused, and it's like, it's you or me, and I've got to be ready to fight to the wire, and you're going to try and punch my head off. So I've got to be ready now for this, you know. So you have to be a bit stoic and box off your feet and get, you know, I'm not going to be like that with my nieces, who are the absolute love and joy of my entire life. I'm not going to be like that when they've, like my little niece the other day, who absolutely face planted, and they did that thing where the lip wobbles and they go blue, and you're like, oh my God. And I'm not going to be like, right, get up now, you know. Of course not. I'm going to be loving, and exactly. We all should be able to choose the human trait, and we won't always get it right, but we should ought to at least try and choose the right trait for the right moment. And that's the problem with leadership. If we think we should be this all the time. Of course not. Of course there's going to be times as a leader, and it depends in what job, a firefighter being one of them, an army general or whatever, where you're just going to have to go, you need to do that now, because people's lives depend on it. You can't have a discussion about feelings. You have to go, Lee, get up that bleeding ladder right now, because someone's hanging out of that window, or you go, you know, whatever. But there'll be times afterwards when you need to sit and go, are you all right, Lee, now you've rescued that person from that? Are you okay now you've seen that corpse? That must have been horrendous. How are you? You've got to adapt like that, but being like that all the time, of course not.
I think that's bound to language again, isn't it? Like that traits, like, you know, talking in traits rather than masculine. It's
a belief system, though, isn't it? That we've labelled this list of things masculine and this list of things feminine. No, they're not. It's not. And then that's the problem. Then that if you display kindness, nurturing, you become feminine. Or what's Lee doing? And if you do too many, you're becoming masculine. No, you're just doing what's right for that moment. And then because then it becomes weird if a bloke is doing too many feminine things, or a woman's doing too many male things, like boxing or like whatever it might be, or there's something wrong. No, it's just you're doing what's right for that time. And if some of us, it's in us. I've met as many men who just think the thought of boxing is the most hideous thing they could ever imagine in their life, as they have women. I don't know why certain ones of us like that sport. It's a mental sport, it's a horrible sport, it's madness, but some of us just like it, and that's okay.
It's addictive, you know.
Other people like other stuff, you know. It's not a male or female thing.
No, definitely. I think we could talk to you all day, Stacey, but I guess for me, there's some really big things that have come out. I spend a lot of time with organisations looking at culture, and I am going to focus on the things that are ridiculed. I am going to focus on the things that are spiky conversations, because that's telling me lots of things about what we might need to move forward to acceptance. And I've never really focused in on that space or had that language to do it, so I'm definitely going to take that. I think conversation, those conversations, but from both perspectives or all perspectives, is equity, and that's how we shift some of those things. And actually, if we can remove the labels And imagine we had job descriptions which were as traits rather than described in the way that they are. And there's a lot of masculine or feminine language, mostly masculine actually, in a lot of that we could just remove. So that has been phenomenal. And with over and above, you are so humble, such a role model. You've achieved so much, but you're just like natural human who challenges the things that we should all be talking about. So fantastic to meet you. Thank you so much.
No, thanks for having me.
Again, just a privilege. Every time I meet you or I see you, it is the stuff that you do. I think you've got an ability to connect on a level that is unsurpassed, and it's great. I'd love to work with you in the future around gender equity and around violence against women and girls. That's some of the stuff I'm doing currently, and yeah, maybe there's a future conversation. But above all that, thank you so much for your time. It's the most precious gift that you've given us, but your insight and your story, but how it relates to leaders out there and what they can do about it. So thank you so much. No,
and thanks for doing this. These conversations are important, and hopefully it changes people's perspectives or reinforce what they think. And as I say, always, I believe in the power of positive petrol pumps, as I call them, which is just getting through everyday life is difficult. Of course it is, because you just want everyone around you to be well and healthy, and sometimes they're not, or you're not. There's all sorts of things that can impact it. Then if you add on wanting to achieve something or change something or aspirations, it can feel like you're going uphill, and that positive petrol tank sometimes can get drained, and you need the people around you that can fill that tank up, whether it's diesel people, it's a bit like my dad, a bit rational and logical, rocket fuel people, that'd be my mum, which is why they divorced before I was one, because they're very different. Then you might have your electric fuel people, your wind farm people, there's all sorts of different, but I think having loads of different types of positive energy around you and different types to fill your tank up with is really important. And things like this can do that. It doesn't have to be someone you know. It can be in that conversation that then galvanises you again and fills your tank up. So that's what you two are hopefully giving to people who listen, and it fills their tank up and they can go on and do more good then, which is a great thing. So thanks for what you're doing.
Brilliant, really purposeful. I love that analogy. Thank you so much.